Welcome to another International Centre for Journalists and International Journalists Network webinar, interactive panel discussion, call it what you will. Today we have two special guests to talk about issues connected to freedom of expression and COVID-19. We're seeing around the world restrictions on reporting, on whistleblowers, and restrictions right through to attacks on journalists, for example. So we want to dig into some of the risks, some of the threats, and also some of the responses to those problems. So joining me today for the ICFJ Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum event are David Kaye. Professor Kaye is the Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression with the UN, and Dr. Courtney Radsch, who is the Director of Advocacy at the Committee to Protect Journalists, CPJ. So we are seeing, as I said, governments worldwide making rapid fire decisions to try to defend citizens and societies from the life-threatening impacts of COVID-19. But increasingly, we're also seeing these decisions threaten or risk undermining fundamental human rights, including, most importantly for our audience, freedom of expression. The threats include laws that are designed to address disinformation, but some of the, shall we say, unintended consequences of those laws include the effective criminalisation of journalism and whistleblowing. They also include, as I said, attacks on journalists. Now they range from verbal attacks through to physical attacks. The perpetrators range from senior politicians through to people on the streets. It's a very difficult environment for journalists to be working in. There are huge safety risks to start with, but these threats pile on to those risks. We also have increased surveillance powers and digital security threats that are posing real challenges for journalists and whistleblowers to ensure that we have a free flow of accurate and reliable information during this pandemic. So what can journalists and news organisations do about these threats? What do they need to know about them? How can they protect themselves from them? And how do they ensure transparency and accountability in government when life and death are not the only things at stake here? So Professor Kaye and Courtney Radsch, thanks very much for joining us this afternoon. We have several hundred people watching us live, and many questions that are coming through already from the participants. David, can I start with you? Just if you can give us a picture of the threats as you see them currently posed by the responses to the pandemic. What do you think are the most important challenges that we need to focus on?
Sure. So thank you. And Julie, thanks for pulling this together. It's great to be on a panel with Courtney and you. So I would start by saying first, what are the standards that we're looking at? I think that we all recognize, and really everybody who's working in journalism and in freedom of expression recognizes that in time of a public health crisis, that there will be some potential for restrictions that we would never accept in other circumstances. And in fact, under international human rights law, which really provides for a robust freedom of expression, the right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers, there's still the possibility for states to restrict that when it's provided by law and when it's necessary and proportionate to protect public health. So there is a framework for restriction, but I think what we're starting to see, or we've seen over the last several weeks, are concerns that are arising in a number of different areas, which suggest either that states are not pursuing necessary restrictions, or they're pursuing restrictions that are simply disproportionate to the nature of the threat. And I would put them, actually, they track a lot what you were suggesting before. I would mention 5 that are real challenges right now. One is access to information that's held by public authorities. So freedom of information laws, are those still being applied and implemented as they should be, particularly in a moment of public health crisis? To what extent are public authorities actually sharing information that is important for the confrontation of the virus? 2, what about access to the internet? There are internet shutdowns around the world. or the slowing of speeds in a place like Kashmir, for example, that are having real harms on public health. And then we can also think about that in terms of the digital divide. People in places of poverty where they don't have ready access, or minorities or women who don't have access to the internet. To what extent is that being provided to them? As you mentioned, promotion and protection of journalism. There are a number of places where we see journalism reporting on COVID-19 being essentially criminalized. People getting knocks at the door from security services, don't report on this. People being denied all sorts of access. Then there's public health disinformation, which I'm sure is a big topic that we'll want to talk about. To what extent should governments be addressing disinformation out there? There are a number of criminalization approaches that are deeply problematic that we could talk about. And also there are issues around disinformation on internet platforms. And then finally, as you mentioned, surveillance. I think all of those things provide or present real challenges to us as a community and to journalists. And I'm sure we'll sort of drill down into those over the course of the hour.
Yeah, that's a good categorization of the major challenges as I see them. From your point of view as well, Courtney, what does CPJ regard as the biggest threats? Are there any examples or themes missing from that list that David shared and what I described earlier, or any that are particularly concerning for you, given your remit?
Well, linked to the issue of the criminalization of journalism, which we are seeing, pick up news speed and gain new dimensions with the whole idea of false news or fake news now being applied to coronavirus. This is an extension of a framework that has attempted to criminalize journalism, for example, reporting on terrorism. Yeah. The issue du jour today, of course, is coronavirus. And we're seeing that there are several countries that have either fake news laws or health laws that criminalize the disinformation, including in the United States, in Puerto Rico, for example. And these laws are then in place, which allow for the arrest of journalists. In addition, we're seeing physical attacks by both governmental authorities as well as the public on journalists, in some cases because journalists are out trying to report, and when authorities aren't doing a good job combating the virus, we can see that becomes a flashpoint. We also see that there have been reports of the public who retaliates against journalists when they perceive journalists as putting them at risk because they're out reporting. We're also tracking, in addition to physical attacks and harassment, online harassment of these journalists. It's a perennial problem, and of course it brings on new dimensions when most journalism now, of course, is taking place online. In addition to the physical threats, we're seeing the restrictions on access, which you already mentioned. This is particularly interesting to think about for freelancers, the challenge that not having the backing of a news organization or, say, accreditation can pose, where not having a press card means that maybe you can't get outside, you can't exert your right as one of the groups that is exempt from quarantine measures, for example. So that's an issue. These shelter in place laws and quarantines, in most cases, do seem to exempt journalists. So everywhere from Kenya to Israel, the US, UK, etc., journalists are being considered exempt. But there are some countries like Iran and New Zealand where journalists have not been declared exempt, or particular categories of journalists, like magazine journalists, are not exempt. And we're also looking at, you mentioned issues of surveillance, but also content moderation and licensing of media. So media licensing and the ability of foreign correspondents to be working in countries. So we know that the Guardian reporter got kicked out of Egypt for reporting on numbers that don't comply with the statistics given out by officials. Same thing in Iraq, they rescinded Reuters licenses. And content moderation, with the transition to primarily algorithmic and automated content moderation, we're keeping an eye on what the impact on journalistic content is.
Yeah, so the inadvertent censorship, if you like, which is a risk that many people are monitoring. And I should just say too that you mentioned online violence there, Courtney. for those people who are familiar with the ICFJ's work on that issue, we are currently engaged in a global research project in partnership with UNESCO and an international tech company, trying to examine what the impacts of online violence are, particularly on female journalists and other human rights defenders. And certainly there is evidence that's noteworthy around the targeting of journalists at the intersection of gender and you know, whether it's religious bigotry or racial and ethnic issues, which is something to note as well. So thanks for pointing that out. I'll just ask people who are participating remotely if you could start sending through your questions, if you haven't done so already. Throughout the next hour, we will try and answer as many of those questions as we can. We're live webcasting through Zoom, but also via Facebook Live to our journalists in the Health Crisis Reporting Forum. So thanks very much for being with us, everybody. Let's dig into some of those issues that you've both raised now. And firstly, if I can come back to you, David, I think towards the end of March, you and colleagues in the Americas and elsewhere who have special rapporteur type functions, whose job it is to monitor challenges to freedom of expression internationally, put out a statement in which you strongly encouraged states to at least adhere to the frameworks that allow for the free flow of information. Now, you gave us a broad overview of some of the challenges that are occurring. Are there any states that you have particular concerns about that you're able to point to give us an illustration tangibly of some of the issues that are coming up for you?
Yeah, I think so. So that's correct that we did issue a statement. This was Harlem Desir, who's the representative on freedom of the media for the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, and Edison Lanza, who's my counterpart as Special Rapporteur in the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights. And I think, you know, we were concerned. This was about 3 or 4 weeks ago. So early on in the kind of global lockdown, you know, we saw that there were a number of states that were taking steps to reduce the flow of information, to carry out the kind of restrictions that Courtney described just a second ago. And, you know, it's hard to pinpoint where there are particular countries that are doing worse than others, but maybe I could mention two areas where I've been especially concerned. So one is the use of emergency legislation in order to say, look, we're in such an emergency that normal freedoms are not available. We see this in Hungary already. So, you know, even in the European context, a context where you have the oversight of the European Court of Human Rights, you're starting to see this kind of real aggressive use of emergency legislation to do the kinds of things that, again, that Courtney was describing, like restricting the access of media to government officials. We also see that in the context outside of emergency legislation. I mean, we've seen, you know, in a number of different places, governments basically saying only these journalists can show up to our press briefings. Or we see ongoing attacks on journalists, verbal attacks, right? So, you know, even in the context of the United States, where I'm sitting today, you know, we've seen the President of the United States attack individual journalists. And, you know, part of it is an attempt to shape a narrative around the coronavirus that is, you know, highly politicized, but it's also an attempt in many parts around places around the world, an attempt to intimidate journalists, you know, not to ask the hard questions. And I think it's important for us to recognize that, you know, much like after a major terrorist attack, or, you know, 9/11 or the Christchurch bombing or something like that, or the massacre, it's very difficult for many people, even for activists and for journalists, to ask hard questions about what government is doing in order to protect the public. And so I think some officials we're seeing are capitalizing on that. And it's important for us to identify those situations. And I've just mentioned a couple. We can, you know, mention many, many others. Unfortunately, Egypt was mentioned before, where we just see that kind of pressure not to ask the questions that need to be asked in order to ensure that the public gets information, and that especially during the crisis, officials, public health officials, politicians are held accountable for what they're doing during the crisis.
I mean, yes, we could add many other countries to that list. I mean, India, for example, we heard last week from Ritu Kapoor, an editor in New Delhi, talking about some of the challenges in trying to report there, but also with the soft censorship or direct interference in trying to craft the narrative from the Modi government, for example. Courtney, what about your observations? You mentioned some of the issues with particular countries before. David there has raised the case of US President Donald Trump. Now, CPJ is a US-based international organization designed to protect journalists globally. And you've said to me in the past that increasingly you're having to turn that lens inwards to the US. And we're in the midst of a debate internationally about how much coverage and when, and should it be live and otherwise, should we give to proponents of disinformation, including political actors, including presidents and prime ministers and so on. What's CPJ's perspective on some of these debates, but in particular, how you respond to domestic challenges as well as the global ones?
I mean, basically, we have to treat the United States as we would any other country. And, we always have, when there were arrests and during Occupy Wall Street, for example, we covered those. But it was really in the wake of the 2016 presidential election that saw so many threats and attacks and online harassment against the press that we decided to create a North America program. We have a US correspondent, and we helped found the US Press Freedom Tracker, which continues to document incidents in the United States. But here in the US, what we're seeing is, once again, the highly problematic and detrimental impact of anti-press rhetoric from the president and others. And the reason that this is problematic is because it sends a signal globally. It is undermining to journalists who are on the front line, literally risking their lives in some cases to bring us news. It is further denigrating the idea that there is fact or truth. And this is the time when we need journalists the most, because most of what the public is going to know about how to keep themselves safe, about combating the coronavirus, about understanding how their government is responding, is going to be coming through the media. So journalists are more important than ever. We're also tracking with deep concern the issue of access to information, freedom of information, the idea that the FBI is saying that they're no longer going to honor records requests and limiting those during the coronavirus pandemic or requiring in-person requests. This is really problematic. We are preparing to launch a report looking at the Trump administration and the press, just as we did with the Obama administration, the press. That will be coming out in about a week and a half, and we'll get into more details just looking at the broad swath of that. But we are seeing this anti-press rhetoric ricochet around the world. President Bolsonaro, President Duterte, kind of the usual suspects. But in this case, the pillaring of the press, as I mentioned earlier, is also leading to public disregard and public fear, which can lead to unsafe conditions for the press.
And direct attacks. And we have a comment, and really it's an observation from a journalist in our network who, I'm not sure where you're from, Amadou Lamrana Bar, but you're pointing out that one of your colleagues is in court today for allegedly obstructing police officers. You say that he was beaten and admitted to hospital, and from there he was taken to appear in court. We'll try and find out, colleagues at ICFJ, if we can, where that incident took place. But as you point out, both of you, this environment where you have verbal attacks, whether that's in the form of rhetoric or direct targeted attacks online or offline from political actors, you're seeing this crossover into physical attacks in certain circumstances as well. We've also had reports from within our network of journalists being roughed up, if you like, by security forces, police officers, law enforcement people as well, many of whom are claiming that they're trying to enforce restrictions on physical movement, or that journalists don't have the appropriate paperwork to be out and about, for example. So That's the combination of political attacks and physical attacks is obviously something that we need to monitor. Also, I think it's important to note that it's not just journalists being attacked, is that it's also whistleblowers and other people trying to share credible information in the public interest. So David, back to you on that. I mean, there are digital dimensions here, but there are also physical world dimensions. We even had a case in the UK, which is where I'm based, of hospital workers being told not to speak publicly about shortages of equipment and so on. And we're seeing, in fact, just overnight, we saw the physical assault of doctors protesting in Pakistan who were trying to raise awareness around these issues. I don't know if you're monitoring that aspect closely, but a number of civil society organisations have started to campaign around the rights of whistleblowers, and of course that's an essential category of journalists' sources when it comes to being able to report in an authoritative and accountable way. What are your particular concerns about that, and what do you think journalists need to be aware of?
Yeah, it's a really important question. I think it's important for people to see that that the moment that we're in, it didn't just start whenever February 1st, March 1st, right? The virus, in a way, emerged into environments of censorship and repression already. And I think the risk, or at least one of the big risks, putting aside the very, very serious public health risks, one of the risks is that that governments use this moment to accomplish some objectives that they've held for many years. So one, for example, that you mentioned is pressure on whistleblowers and journalistic sources. And if you think about it in the context of how this surveillance, the public health surveillance tools will start to be expanded, I think we should be really concerned, and this should be something journalists should watch very carefully, as to whether those are being used for the narrow purposes of things like contact tracing and real important public health interventions, or whether they're being expanded to interfere with the relationship between a journalist and her sources. And that's been something that we've seen for many years, a kind of degradation of that ability for journalists to protect the confidentiality of their sources. Absolutely. Who are very often whistleblowers. So I think that's something, that is very important for journalists and for civil society to be tracking very closely. And I think that also ties to what you were describing in terms of physical attacks. And as the question raised, in many countries around the world, we're talking about not just government, police forces, security services, which typically see criticism of government as a criminalized, or a thing that can be criminalized, a reason to detain a journalist. Well, now, when you have real reporting on the spread of a disease that, the disease has its natural angle to it, its scientific and medical one, but it also has the political one. And when people start to report in different countries about, the failures of government to advise people about the nature of the threat, where they've downplayed it or actually in an affirmative way hid information, I'm really concerned that governments are going to start to use those tools of defamation, whether it's criminal defamation, or the tools of civil litigation, essentially slap suits, to really crack down on public information, that those things are going to expand. They already exist. That's the thing. We're working in many countries at a baseline that is already problematic. The problem is, in this emergency, will they start to use those tools in a more aggressive and problematic way?
Yeah, I mean, we had examples raised also from within our community around the extension of licensing requirements. Some of the, I suppose, the less physically violent, if you like, attacks on journalists can include things that are designed to restrict their movements, to prevent them having access to particular sources, for example, the restrictions on who they can contact. So we had an Indian journalist who commented on the fact that they're only able to access official sources, and you know, the effective criminalization of reporting on content that is not official. In fact, I've just had a question now posed by Ankita from Deutsche Welle News, who I think is based in India. She says that there is increased misinformation, which gets us to one of the other 5 key themes we're talking about here, around COVID-19, which has been problematic. So people are misinformed or disinformed, as the case may be, and there have been reports of violence on people who are suspected of having coronavirus. She says she's scared that the government may crack down on journalists in the name of curbing misinformation. I think it's fair to say that's already happening both there and in many other countries around the world. So this brings us into that territory of attempts to combat disinformation and misinformation, depending on how you categorize what the World Health Organization has referred to as an infodemic, which is, you know, happening in parallel with the pandemic. And David and Courtney, you've each touched on this already, but have you got particular cases that you'd like to point to around the world that are illustrative of this, to give us some concrete examples? I mean, I know South Africa rolled out a law that effectively criminalized the creation and distribution of mis and disinformation. There are potentially jail sentences attached to those acts, and there are many other countries that we could identify. Courtney, I'll start with you, particularly with regard to laws being applied to journalists and journalism, if you can.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the biggest things that we're tracking, really ricocheting around the world. We saw in Iran, they announced prison sentences of up to 3 years for anyone who spreads false news. You mentioned South Africa, which the disaster management regulations criminalizes the publishing of any false statement related to COVID-19. Puerto Rico just announced that it's criminalizing any dissemination of disinformation with criminal prison penalties as well as fines. You've got Taiwan, where you can face a maximum of 3 years. In Singapore, they have a false news law in place. It's not yet been used against journalists, but it's there. Bangladesh, Uzbekistan, Lesotho. I mean, I have a whole list of these countries, but basically the takeaway is it's happening around the world. Yeah. Now, India, you mentioned India. We did this really fascinating Q&A with an Indian journalist named Vidya Krishnan about navigating harassment and the challenge of doing journalism during this time. And one of the things that is happening in India is, on the one hand, you've got the government, which is not being forthcoming with information. So it's not like, you know, use the government information or, you know, don't use anything at all. They're not replying to calls. They're not providing access to information. And, you know, it's hard sometimes as a journalist to get a call back from a government. So, you know, that does not help with fighting misinformation or disinformation when the government is not responsive to journalistic requests. And then, of course, you've just got the broader harassment from President Modi, the criminalization of aspects of journalism, the vast surveillance network that's being created there. But, you know, this idea of combating disinformation through criminal statute, first of all, I don't think that there is any evidence that that works. And if anything, there's evidence that it doesn't work, because if you look at the response to 9/11 and the so-called war on terror, what we saw is that that gave rise to the spread of anti-terrorism laws around the world that were used to jail journalists, among other things. But the problem is, who decides what's false? How do you know whether it's false or simply no longer the advice or the correct information? I mean, one of the things that stands out about this virus is that it's novel, which means we don't know a lot of the information. We don't have a lot of the facts. And journalists are there to report on what is known and to report on what public figures say. So if you've got a president or another public figure saying inaccurate information or giving inaccurate figures, there's a high likelihood that can then get recycled through the media. Not to mention the fact that You've got many of these world leaders on social media platforms putting out their own spin on things. And then where do journalists, determine is the truth? So, I think we need to look at alternative mechanisms to staving the flow of disinformation and not trying to put journalists in prison for that, especially because prison could amount to a death sentence with coronavirus, right? You cannot social distance in prison. They don't have good hygiene. Many prisons, as in, for example, Egypt, your family has to bring you food. So in some cases, they've prevented public visits, which means they're, it's just a terrible situation. So not only should we not be criminalizing this, we should be letting all the journalists out of prison.
Yeah, some excellent points. And I've just got another comment and a question from Azerbaijan asking for you perhaps to comment on what's happening there. This person who, for good reason, I won't identify, talks about the regime issuing restrictions on coverage, particularly on social media, and makes the important point that we haven't directly made yet, that bloggers and social media commentators are, of course, being targeted significantly in these crackdowns connected to, allegedly connected to disinformation and so-called fake news laws, as problematic as that labeling is. David, can I get you to comment on the sort of social media aspects of this? Courtney's already raised the point that many of the proponents of some of the most sticky, if you like, aspects of disinformation are actually political leaders, including some political leaders from the West. But on social media platforms, we are seeing, the viral amplification of disinformation, which understandably World Health Organization and individual states are concerned about. But what are you seeing at the moment? And if you'd like to highlight any concerns about the ways in which general attempts to share information in the public interest on social media platforms and people's broader rights to freedom of expression, to self-publish, for example, are potentially being infringed.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. So, I mean, just to start with Azerbaijan, Azerbaijan is a really good example of a place where there's been not just threats, but real attacks on journalists over the years. And so for the virus and the public health initiatives to enter into that space, I think it's just going to exacerbate an already difficult circumstance, a difficult situation for journalists, for bloggers, for people on social media and so forth. So that's a really good, but also really troubling example, and it's multiplied around the world. On the social media side, and I saw there was also a question about this in terms of the responsibility of the companies. There's a couple of things happening that have been, pretty widely reported. The first is, because of the virus, because of the lockdowns around the world and the need for social distancing, many of the content moderators around the world, those who are basically, subcontracted out by the companies to make the decisions as to what information can stay on the platform and what must come down. Many of those people have been sent home, and because of different privacy concerns, allegedly, a lot of that content moderation isn't taking place. And as Courtney said at the beginning, it's being done by automation. Now, and the companies have been pretty aggressive, I think, generally speaking, in a positive way in addressing the kinds of disinformation that can be harmful to people's health, right? So highlighting, information and guidance from the World Health Organization or a local public authority, maybe the CDC. I mean, I think it should be the WHO for global purposes. Mm-hmm. And that part is positive, but I think it's really early that we do not know the extent to which automation, and Facebook admitted when they mentioned this publicly that they were going to make mistakes, but we don't know the full extent to which automation will result in the taking down of content that is really important for people to see, right? Mm-hmm. That is important for people to understand, well, where is the spread of coronavirus in my community? We don't have too much transparency into whether governments, even now, are making demands on the companies to restrict information about the spread of the virus in communities. And I think, you know, the companies have a real responsibility to make sure that what they are doing is consistent with their obligation to respect the human rights of their users and to respect the political freedoms and freedoms of expression and other freedoms that the public holds as well beyond their platforms. So I think that, you know, at this moment, there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of opacity around what's happening on the platforms. And it's going to be essential for there to be more clarity about what's happening. We could talk also, and maybe we will, about the specific rules around disinformation that should apply. But I think there's so much, there's so much happening and so little knowledge about what the companies and what governments are doing that, you know, we have to talk about real high-level principles at first.
Yeah.
Can I jump in on that?
Sure.
Because so a group of us who in civil society who've been working on the issues related to content moderation, again, kind of starting under terrorism and now seeing coronavirus, we are going to be putting out an open letter, and I'm happy to send that to ICFJ, and David, obviously hope you'll support it. It's a very just simple, straightforward request to all of the platform companies to preserve the content they're taking down. We'll deal with access issues, privacy issues, how to be compliant with GDPR, whatever later. But if we don't preserve the data now related to the content and the accounts and how this is taken down, we are losing a huge trove of very important information that is important not only to protecting our human rights, but to potentially addressing the infodemic aspect of the pandemic. So I hope that we'll get widespread support, not only from the human rights and journalistic community, but from the scientific research community. And this is really hoping to make this a big statement.
It's a really pertinent issue, the absence of access to that data, for example, so that researchers can examine not just the kinds of disinformation content that is being flagged with a view to understanding what kinds of themes are, you know, associated with this level of disinformation, but also the networked aspect of this, you know, who's sharing with whom and how widespread is some of this. So I think that sounds like a really important initiative, and we'll be pleased to have a look at that, Courtney. I should also say that ICFJ has partnered with UNESCO and other organisations to produce a study on responses to the disinformation crisis that we see in connection with COVID-19, and that will be coming out in coming weeks as well. And it goes to some of the issues in particular, David, that you've been highlighting around you know, what are the parameters connected to responses? And yes, there's proportionality and necessity, but one of the things that is really, I think, pertinent is the longevity of some of these actions. You know, are there sunset clauses? Are there caveats? And I think, Courtney, you referred to that as well.
If I could jump in there, Julie, because
please.
I think there's an important point here about the power of the companies. Right? Because I think what we're seeing right now is one of the results of companies that are super dominant in this space. And, you know, when you have platforms that have billions of users, and even those that don't have billions of users, that simply have a huge impact on the information ecosystem, I think we see that I mean, the problems that arise from that when you're in the context of a public health crisis, and the companies are, I think if they're honest with us, they would acknowledge that they're in a moment where it's even difficult for them to figure out not only what the rules should be and how they should apply in this context, but also how they can actually implement them when they're in lockdown. You know, this is, we're I think in a lot of ways in uncharted territory, because in other crises, it hasn't actually required the companies to lock down. And suddenly you have platforms that are governed by, I mean, the human has been taken out of the loop in many circumstances. And the human in the loop, that is the human who is trained to do the content moderation around the particular rules that the company has in place, that's an important check, even if it doesn't always work. It's an important check on the work that they're doing. And without that, I think we're really at a stage where we don't know exactly what what that information flow looks like on the platforms. It's really troubling, to be honest. And I'm not saying that it's the platform's fault for it. They couldn't necessarily have seen this in the clearest way that they may that they perhaps needed to, but I think it's something we should be really focused on to a certain extent.
Yeah, and I mean, we wouldn't be the first to observe that it's probably noteworthy that when it came to political disinformation and disruption to democracy, the platforms were not as quick to act as they have been now, even in the context of the lockdown that you're referring to there, David. But these are some questions to come back to, in fact, about how we can collectively respond. I just want to take some more questions from our audience now. And we have one from a freelancer, David Schutz, who says he'd like to know if he has the same or equal right to be reporting as a staff reporter with an outlet, and if so, and I'm asked what outlet I'm with, I want to be armed with a response that boosts my chances to be allowed to report. I think that's one for you, Courtney, in particular. Do you have suggestions there?
Yeah, so it really depends on what country you're working in. So, you know, we don't have, for example, in the United States, a definition of a journalist. So in some countries, for example, in India, they are requiring a press card or some sort of proof that you have an assignment. So that can be really challenging for freelancers. I mean, you know, what I would do is try to get a press card if you can, for example, from the Frontline Freelance Register, which, you know, obviously they're also in quarantine, so they're not printing cards, but think about joining a group like that, or like your, you know, local Society of Professional Journalists chapter, or whatever the syndicate in your town is, or other freelance groups like the Culture of Safety Alliance, ACOS Alliance. Also think about bringing clips with you to show that you have been published. If you do have an assignment that you've been given, you could bring that. And definitely make sure that you are reporting in a safe and smart way. We have a bunch of safety resources in almost 40 languages on our website, cpj.org/COVID-19. And it includes things like the basics: wash your hands, wear a mask, but also, you know, if you're doing interviews, can you use a longer microphone so you don't have to get so close to someone? You know, tips for photographers who obviously need to be there in person taking the photo and can't work from behind their computer. So take a look at that, stay safe, and think about, you know, what you can find out. You should find out whether or not journalists are exempt from quarantine in the particular locality that you're in, so that you understand, you know, whether or not you're potentially breaking a regulation or not, and be prepared to address, you know, why it is that you're out there reporting and what you're doing to keep yourself safe.
Okay, great. We have another question from Anna Myers, who's with the WIN Whistleblower Network, who many of us working in investigative journalism know as somebody who advocates for whistleblowers and confidential sources. She asks a question that helps us move in the direction I think we now need to take this conversation, which is, how do we respond to these challenges collectively as a community of journalists and freedom of expression advocates, particularly looking longer term? I mean, we've already had during this conversation references made to the potential long-term impacts of some of the measures that are being put in place now. So Anna asks specifically, what happens when eventually this is over? And, you know, for context, in many countries, there's conversations around this being 12 to 18 months worth of restrictions in place. And presumably that, at least in the minds of some states, means restrictions on freedom of expression that have been put in place could last at least that long. Anna's question is, are we well enough prepared as a freedom of expression community to deal with the threats that might be ongoing for whistleblowers? And will they feel that they can actually speak out after some of these restrictions are lifted, and what the risks might be to them longer term? Do either of you want to comment on that?
I mean, I would jump in on that on a couple of things. So one, do what you can this short term to protect the potential long-term implications. What do I mean by this? Think about the digital security and the confidentiality of the communications that you're having with journalists. So, you know, we hope that there will continue to be whistleblowers. But think about the fact that that will probably be happening purely electronically now, right? Digitally. Probably not going to meet that person in person during a social distancing guidelines. So you need to make sure that you are taking the precautions to protect the confidentiality of your sources and your communication. So that's one like very concrete thing that you personally can do. But I think also we are seeing some good reporting on what is in these emergency laws. How long do they last? Are there sunset clauses? Did they report to the United Nations as required that they are implementing national, these emergency laws? I'll give you the answer to that one. It's no. So we can be advocating for things like that. And I think that we have seen, I think, quite quickly in our community coming together to push for the basic principles that we know need to be put in place: necessary, proportionate, sunset clauses, limited in scope, because it's not about restricting what governments can do to legitimately combat the virus. It's making sure that they don't go beyond that and use these new powers in a way that was not meant to be authorized. But where we can see again, the Patriot Act, for example, which was used to legitimize torture, which was used to legitimize mass surveillance on the American and global population. These things were not meant to be put in place. So we need to make sure that we have, I think, limitations, and journalists can help with that by reporting on this, by doing those jobs. And I think we have to push back on efforts by the governments to say, oh, we can't provide information during this time. If anything, this should be a call to governments to digitize the FOIA request, the Freedom of Information or Access to Information systems that they have in place, and to be thinking proactively, how can government officials continue to brief the press and provide opportunities for engagement? Because a one-way communication without the opportunity for journalists to ask questions is not sufficient.
And look, we have many questions coming in. I've got about 40 questions that I haven't even managed to read yet. So thank you everybody for asking them. Just to follow up on what Courtney said, there are resources, and this segs with what Anna said or asked as well. There are many resources out there. You can search for what CPJ has published on protecting your sources digitally, digital security, threats. Certainly, David, you have written and reported to the UN on these themes. I published a book with UNESCO called Protecting Journalism Sources in the Digital Age. And there's something called the Perugia Principles for working with whistleblowers, which I would encourage you all to look at. And I think this is not something we have delved into in any great detail yet, but has really critical implications for our ability to report in a secure way while we're in lockdown. And so many of us are physically in lockdown, as Courtney has said, being forced to rely on digital communications. And we'll share many of the resources we're talking about in a write-up on ICFJ and IJNet that will follow this webinar. It'll be live within the next 24 hours, and we'll distribute that as widely as we can. And just to encourage you, particularly the journalists and the experts in the audience, to join ICFJ's Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum. You can find information about that on the website, which is where you'll be able to connect with each other as well as access many of these resources. Now, I had a question also from Zoe Titus, who's based in Namibia and with the Namibia Media Trust. She's commenting on the ways in which communications are being centralized by governments, and governments are determining who can speak and when, which is hindering independent critical reportage. I have also observed that even among my community, my own, as a journalist, as a former political and investigative reporter myself, I'm still connected via social media to many international colleagues who are still reporting. And I have to say, I've noticed a kind of reluctance to critique state responses to this crisis. I wonder if either of you could comment on the need to continue to push for sort of robust and independent critical reporting, even at a time like this, and to ensure that it's not perceived to be, unpatriotic, if you like. David, do you want to start?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it actually ties to Anna's question as well, in the sense that there's a real need for both journalistic solidarity. I don't mean, the kind of solidarity that means you just have to agree with everything, your colleagues write, but there does need to be a kind of solidarity around the mission of providing information, verifiable information to the public. And, we don't see that everywhere. Courtney mentioned some different societies and kind of associations and unions of journalists. Those can be really important tools to ensure that there is that kind of solidarity when journalists get attacked. So if a journalist of a competing organization is attacked, even if it's just a verbal attack, we should see some response from other journalists as well to support that journalist. So I think there's that aspect. I think also that, and this ties also directly to Anna's question about the community of freedom of expression activists. There was a lot of pressure after 9/11, for example, and this is true after every major terrorist attack, for activists and for advocates in law, not to take aggressive moves against government actors. And that means, don't file the lawsuit if you don't have to. Don't file that FOIA request if you don't really have to. And I think that's not the right approach. I mean, I think there should be, in addition to the kind of the professional solidarity, there should be, and we do see this. I've been really impressed to see the way in which organizations have been working in real collaboration over the last several weeks on a lot of these issues. But there should be a continued push to seek information, even where you think it might not be the easiest ask at the moment, and where you're denied. The regular tools of FOIA litigation, of freedom of information litigation, are still available, and those should still be used too. And there should be support for them. There shouldn't be any attack on those using those tools, because we actually are in, as you mentioned, the WHO talks about an infodemic. Like, we're really in a situation where those who are involved in freedom of expression, advocacy, and in journalism have a real opportunity to help uncover the information that the public needs to get, and they should be using those tools.
Yeah, where they're available. And I mean, there's examples of course, coming from our community where those tools are not available. And not only that, where according to one journalist from Morocco, there's an attempt to limit reporting of the daily statistical updates on the contraction of the virus and the incidence of the virus and the mortality rates and so on to official government figures only. I mean, there's so many challenges, aren't there, in this space to be able to report accurately and reliably in the public interest. One needs to access information, and that information is not always most accurate, at the source of government where information is being politicized, for example. So I'd just like to begin to wind up now. For the next 10 minutes or so, we can focus on perhaps what we can do as a community of journalists and a community of freedom of expression advocates and researchers internationally. Courtney, I'll start with you. I mean, David pointed out there have been examples of collaboration. You pointed to some of the examples you've seen of good reporting, but can you be a bit more specific? Give us something that you've seen that you think might be instructive for journalists wanting perhaps to work with one another or even independently on investigations that you think actually help support these fundamental rights that we need to be able to do our job in addition to just reporting accurately on the crisis.
Well, this issue of centralizing information in specific government departments, and couple that with the lack of proactive provision of information, we should not be required to file a FOIA lawsuit every time a journalist needs information. So I think that we have seen success on some intractable issues like impunity, for example, when journalistic outlets band together. So Forbidden Stories, for example, which continues the investigations of journalists who are murdered, like Daphne Caruana Galizia, for example. I think there are many more collaborations taking place. I think if we think about how journalists can band together to require the government to provide proactively information in a digitized form to address the current situation that we're in, holds some promise. I think another thing that we really need to see solidarity in is, as David mentioned, when there are attacks on journalists. And one of the most profound ones, and I posted a link in the chat right now, is the 250 journalists who are behind bars for doing their job. They need to be released. I mean, all political prisoners and prisoners of conscience should be released. I'd like to see the journalistic community come behind that. Certainly the free expression community is. We have a campaign that's global. We've seen regional campaigns in the Middle East, Kyrgyzstan, in many countries where this is seen as an urgent issue. I think the media fraternity joining in, realizing that we've never needed journalists more than we need them now, because they really are the interface with the public, and they're the ones that are fact checking the officials who are taking directly to social media to put out their message or their spin or their version of facts. The journalists are going to go out and talk to independent experts. So I'd like to see solidarity around protection and the freeing of their colleagues, and then also around access to information and pressuring governments. We're talking about this going on for several more weeks, maybe months. Governments, this is the time at the local, national, and frankly international level to get on board with providing information proactively and in a way that journalists who are essentially desk bound can act.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So collaborative modes of investigation. You gave us that great example of the journalists who continue to investigate the murder with impunity of Daphne Caruana Galizia, for example. Maybe there's a model there that journalists working on the coronavirus responses could actually adopt, trying to map beyond what civil society is doing. CPJ is doing great stuff. The International Press Institute, Index on Censorship are all tracking these developments, but there's stories to be told there connected to those. So that's some good inspiration. David, we have a question from a colleague at UNESCO who wants to know what UNESCO and other UN agencies could most effectively do in terms of the way they're responding. And I'm glad to hear them ask that question. So you are in this special provision, special role rather, as the special rapporteur, whose job it is to try to call states to account, but also other UN agencies. What would you like to see done there? How could that work be ramped up?
Yeah. So first, just want to say I agree with everything that Courtney just said, and especially want to associate with the initiative that they've been pushing recently over the release of journalists from prison. It's unlawful already to criminalize journalism, but as Courtney put it, it's like a death threat, or death sentence, added. It's insult upon insult in a legal way, and it's really important that states do the right thing and release, however they want to frame it, release journalists and other prisoners as well. So in terms of what the international organizations and international community can do, I think the first thing is to be available to hear complaints from individuals and organizations from around the world. So in my own role, as both of you know, we accept from all over the world information from people about the kinds of threats that they see to their ability to carry out the function of journalism, or to do advocacy, or whatever it might be. So I would really encourage people to reach out directly to my mandate. UNESCO also has a very important role to play in, both in the context of, its upcoming World Press Freedom Day, and gathering information and stories about what's happening out in the world around coronavirus and the steps being taken to confront it. So I think there's a real role for the organizations to play. I think it's been interesting and important for top leaders, including Dr. Tedros at the WHO, to emphasize in their public statements that as important as the public health measures are, the human rights that everybody enjoys do not simply evaporate in the context of any kind of emergency. And certainly the freedom of opinion and the freedom of expression should be understood as part of the effort of confronting coronavirus. And I think we need to hear that message over and over from people in leadership positions, whether in government or in intergovernmental organizations. And like I said, I was pleased to see in Dr. Tedros's speech maybe a week or two ago that he put human rights up front in his statement. But we need to hear that from all levels, and we need to have specificity. And then the last thing I would say is, I think as organizations, as advocates, and as journalists are tracking and asking questions of governments, those should be very specific questions. You know, we really do need specific information about what government knows and what government is doing in order to protect the public. And I think those specific questions, really the kind of questions that put government on the spot to share what they know, are incredibly important at this particular moment. And I think those of us in international organizations and in the NGO community can be supportive in pushing those things forward and protecting those who are asking the hard questions.
And it becomes really important that these interventions are urgently enacted, doesn't it? That research is published quickly, that recommendations are issued with a degree of urgency. We can't be actually playing catch up in 6 months' time around freedom of expression threats that have become a reality.
Right, and I would say that one of the areas where that's most important, because there will be so much pressure not to write about this, will be in the area of surveillance. It's going to be very important for journalists and for organizations to be really on top of what the new surveillance regimes look like, how they're sunsetted, as Courtney was suggesting, how they're implemented, how private personal health data is protected, how it's shared. Like, all of those things are going to be extremely important. They're going to get fairly technical, but we're going to have to be on top of it. And I would just say that I know that international organizations and other rapporteurs, not just myself, but others, will be very interested to help not only, pursue that kind of that information, but also to protect those who feel that they're under threat.
Yeah. Courtney, to come to you, last week in a similar discussion, Maria Ressa, internationally renowned journalist and editor, herself, who is facing this month the prospect of imprisonment in reference to freedom of expression related charges, she said that this is journalism's extinction event, potentially. And that's a phrase that I've heard others using as well. One of our audience members wants to know then, how do we get through this? And if we can frame that particularly from a rights perspective, how optimistic or pessimistic are you at this point?
Well, I'm cautiously optimistic, just because I do see that there is a lot of awareness about needing to think about limitations and restrictions and use cases and sunset clauses, whether we're talking about surveillance or emergency laws or other things, because there were some lessons learned from the so-called war on terror. I don't think it's widespread enough. I think that part of what journalists need to do is do a really good job doing journalism so that the public understands the importance of their role and is on their side, because it's very hard to, I think, protect journalists' rights, and which are fundamentally the rights of the public to be informed, if the public is scared and they don't really see the value of journalism. Actually, today, right now, there's a campaign that the National Association of Hispanic Journalists and dozens of other organizations are doing on social media called Press Essential, to talk about the essential role of the press during this time in informing the public. And also remember that despite the fact that it might seem like nothing else besides coronavirus is happening, in fact, everything else is still happening, right? So you mentioned Maria Ressa from Rappler. She's going on trial for a cybercrime law, a cybercrime charge related to their law there. So we have to be vigilant. We have to make sure that we're letting the Philippine government know that we are watching, that we care. In Cameroon yesterday, Maxence Mello, a journalist, was on trial there and convicted. We need to make sure that we're not forgetting about all the other stories during this time. But I do worry about, to go to David's point and just to build on that, all of these new technological capacities that that many governments are now realizing are capable of gathering this type of data, of doing this type of data analysis, of tracking these people, of using telecom data, geolocation, Bluetooth, all of these really sophisticated surveillance approaches. When we create a capacity, it might be for one thing, but governments are going to want to use it for many other things. And so that's what I'm really worried about. I'm really worried about, what are the new capacities we're creating and the new precedents we're setting, and what is that going to mean for the future? And that's why we cannot wait until this crisis is over. We need to put in the restrictions and the safeguards and the limitations now. And we need to, like I mentioned earlier, make sure that the companies are preserving the information so that we can go back and do the analysis that we really need to do to understand the whole scope of this, and make sure that this is not an extinction event for journalism, because if journalism is extinguished, then so is democracy.
And indeed, and David, if you can round up the discussion for us, and then I'll wind it up officially. But one final question from Zejal Palmer, who asked if there are any silver linings in this crisis with regard to its implications for freedom of expression, which I think is hopefully a good note to end on. I mean, what could we see a rallying around the need to defend and protect rights in the context of even a pandemic as deadly as this one?
Yeah. Hi, Sejal. It's a great question. I'm not usually a silver linings person, particularly at a moment like this, but I do think that and this won't just happen naturally. I mean, it requires people who are attendees, and it requires the work of ourselves to push this forward. But I think that one thing people can see is the importance of information at a time of crisis. Here it happens to be a health crisis, but it could be any other kind of crisis. And I think that, and the fact that, even if you look at the WHO's specific guidance on how to deal with epidemics, with disease outbreaks, they put front and center the importance of information, of proactive government sharing of information, of an information ecosystem that allows for reporting and the sharing of information. It does not talk about criminalization and all the other things that we fear, I think. So, I mean, to the extent there's any silver lining, perhaps it's clearly something we have to take advantage of. And that advantage is, look how important information is in this environment. Look how important it is to be clear about the kind of information you're sharing with the public. I think all of those things can be positives, and we just have to translate those into positives. But I think people see that maybe in a way that they may not have seen it, or that was harder for us to articulate, say, 6 weeks ago.
Okay, great. And I should just say, before waving everybody goodbye, that as we've been talking, ICFJ and IJNet and the Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum have just launched a major global research partnership with the Tao Center at Columbia University. So we will be studying journalism and the pandemic, and very much emphasizing these challenges connected to freedom of expression, such as journalism safety and censorship and surveillance as part of that remit. So we really welcome your participation today. David Kaye, UN Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression, at least for the next few months, I think. Your term is rapidly coming to a close. And Courtney Radsch, who is the Advocacy Director for the Committee to Protect Journalists. I think what we've seen here is a collaboration between three different kinds of organisations or functions, if you like, today. And let's hope that our community is also similarly inspired by some of the things we've been talking about and some of the ideas coming through. To all of the people who ask questions, there are so many of you and so many questions coming through. I've just seen one flash up from Mustafa in Egypt, who, for example, asks, How do we know which numbers to trust if not from government? I mean, all of these questions are really difficult and pertinent. And what I will say to you is apart from apologising for the fact that we haven't been able to get to all of your questions, we will feed them through to our network, and with IJNet suggests that some of them might be excellent opportunities for stories to be written in response to some of the questions you've asked. So keep the conversation coming, and also ensure that the reporting you're doing is also mindful of the advocacy efforts that are going on around the world. Thanks very much again, everybody. Stay safe, and keep talking freely and openly as much as you can. Thanks. Bye-bye for now.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.